I was going to make this video about sci-fi melee weapons, but it occurred to me that before I can do that, we first need to look at why people love certain melee weapons at all. The big one today is going to be swords, obviously, but we'll also discuss a few others that at a first glance don't seem to make any sense, namely scythes and hammers. For the most part, we're going to focus on the symbolism behind these weapons, not just their practicality, apart from how it plays into the symbolism. We'll talk more about practicality in a future video. Whether we're talking about fantasy settings, historical fiction, or sci-fi, there's a remarkable amount of obsession in fiction with particular melee weapons, even when it might not make any sense. For example, if your characters live in a world where guns and magic exist, why would they use a sword? People's love of swords as a weapon almost seems to cross the line to an obsession, especially when considering how in many time periods, swords weren't used as a mainline weapon. This even crosses over into different cultures. From Western Europe all the way to Japan, a lot of cultures are obsessed with swords. Now, I know people are going to try and argue that it's because swords are phallic weapons, so let me explain something to anyone who doesn't have a pickle between their legs. It doesn't come with blades on the side. I can't slash someone with it, I can't parry an enemy's weapon with it, I can't even use it as a butter knife. And I don't know of anyone else who can do those things either. The most phallic weapon used in warfare throughout the ages wasn't the sword, it was the spear, a weapon that can be used for thrusting, and only for thrusting. Some swords, like the scimitar or the khopesh, aren't very good for thrusting. And funnily enough, the spear was actually the mainline weapon used in most militaries throughout the ancient world. It was the spear, not the sword, that dominated the Bronze Age and made things like the phalanx formation possible. Some of this was because spears were a lot easier to make. Technically, you can make a spear out of a piece of flint and a long stick, and making a better spear out of copper or bronze wasn't too difficult once we mastered metal shaping. And even after ironworking was developed, spears were so much cheaper to make than swords because the weapon was mostly made out of wood. With swords, people tried to make them out of bronze or copper, but they weren't very good, meaning the basic idea has been around since before we could make it practical. It wasn't until the development of ironworking that people could actually make a decent sword. So it's kind of weird that Perseus in Greek mythology is always portrayed having cut off Medusa's head with a sword. Supposedly it was made out of either adamantium or diamond, and in some versions, it's the same blade that was used by Kronos to castrate Uranus. Then we have Marmidos, a sword that sometimes gets wielded by Heracles or more often Hercules, which makes a bit more sense because the Romans had developed ironworking, and this weapon actually gets tied into Arthurian legend. Now, if you were trying to use a sword instead of a spear in a phalanx, your weapon would be too short for the formation to work. And if you made a sword that was long enough, it would be so heavy that most soldiers wouldn't be able to hold it up for very long. Wood is light, iron is heavy, and even if you are strong enough to hold it upright, it's going to tire you out pretty quickly. Swords really weren't used much in large formations, but our typical hero usually isn't fighting in part of a battle line. You never hear of Heracles or Perseus fighting in a phalanx, and that might be part of the reason why swords are so popular. What a sword lacks in its ability to work for group formation tactics, it makes up for in its flexibility. And from a writer's perspective, this is huge. Any good writer knows that there are some bad guys that you want to go down quickly and efficiently, maybe even painlessly, since you don't want your hero to look like a cruel monster. But then there are enemies you actually want to take your time with, either because they deserve a drawn-out fight scene, or a much slower, bloodier death, or what have you. And swords offer you a lot of flexibility to do both of these things. A spear can kill someone quickly by puncturing their neck, sure, and it can also bleed someone out by 1,000 cuts and jabs. But there's a limited number of ways you can do things like that with the spear, and the same goes for an axe. And you can really only write, "the hero stabbed the bad guy in the neck," so many times before it starts to get boring. But then there's the cost of making a sword versus making a spear. As I mentioned before, you need a lot more metal to make a sword than any other ancient weapon. Which meant that in the days of the Bronze Age and many other periods of history, swords were only owned by the wealthy, which usually meant the nobility. Which puts their role as a sidearm in a strange light, because that's one expensive side piece. Now, swords did get somewhat cheaper at periods of history when metalworking became easier to produce. And it should be noted that during the days of the Roman Empire, the gladius was their mainline weapon. In this period, heroes in myths and legends using swords doesn't stand out very much because everyone else was using them too. But it did lead to a perfect explanation as to why an ancient sword might be better than anything made by your local medieval blacksmith. The idea that some ancient weapon from a long time ago is somehow better than anything we can make now really became popular during the Middle Ages, for obvious reasons, and a lot of swords and myths and legends were said to have been made through lost arts from the Roman Empire. This includes Excalibur in some versions. There's also religious elements to consider. Once crossguards were added to the swords, they took a shape of a cross, and a lot of swords became particularly ornate in the effort to further emphasize this fact. Even after other types of guards were invented, and were proven even more effective at protecting the wielder's hands, the crossguard remained popular because of its religious symbolism. But it wasn't just Western religions like Christianity that promoted this idea. In Japan, particularly under Shintoism, the sword is an object associated with divinity. First, in the Shinto creation myth, the two creator gods, Izanagi and Izanami, dip a coral blade into the ocean to form the archipelago that would become Japan. Then, in another story, the god Susanoo slays the eight-headed dragon Orochi and takes the fabled sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi, meaning grass cutter, which would become one of the sacred treasures of the imperial regalia, and became a symbol of the virtue of valor. Mind you, this is all from a culture on an island where the available iron is of such poor quality that they had to develop the folding metal technique to remove some of the impurities from the ore. Swords made using this technique were incredibly brittle compared to their counterparts in Europe and the Middle East, while still being just as costly. So, they were mostly expensive pieces of crap, at least until they were able to get access to some better sources of iron or better purify the stuff that they had. And like with European and ancient armies, the sword wasn't the main go-to weapon for soldiers in Japanese battle lines. Their primary weapons were the bow and the pike, and the sword was a sidearm. Now the word katana literally just means sword, and technically any Japanese sword could qualify as a katana. But the weapon that people usually refer to as a katana had a particularly thick blade, which meant it was less likely to snap off, but it was also almost useless against an armored opponent. It was used more often for cutting down peasants than fighting enemy soldiers. But that might have been part of the charm. To use a sword against an enemy soldier required a great deal of skill and training, the likes of which only a professional warrior could have, usually someone of noble birth. Your average foot soldier would be unlikely to have the kind of training with a sword to fight other soldiers on an even footing, especially if he's up against an enemy with a pike, or a similarly longer range weapon. In short, a sword-wielding warrior could simultaneously be an underdog and a person of nobility, if that makes any sense. All of this, combined with the religious significance of swords, made them just as popular in Japanese culture as they were in the West. What I find curious is the fact that they never got the same popularity throughout the rest of Asia, leading me to wonder why swords made their way into Japanese mythology in the first place. Perhaps it has to do with the shape of the archipelago, but could that really be all there is to it? Whatever the reason, the fact of the matter is that in both cultures, swords are associated with a high level of skill and symbolism that made them extremely popular for heroes, and their flexibility, both from a writer's standpoint and the actual wielders, can make for some great action scenes. But another element of the sword that I didn't bring up yet is the fact that they're much easier to wear on your person compared to a spear. This might not seem like much, but a lot of people have noticed that a modern equivalent, at least in a country with Second Amendment rights, would be the revolver. Revolvers aren't as useful in large-scale military involvements anymore, but they're the weapon of choice for a lone heroic gunman. More flexible than a rifle, though not as good at long range, easier to wear comfortably on your person, and generally reflecting a greater level of skill for the person wielding it. In particular, a hero with a revolver who can take out 6 bandits with 6 bullets is always going to look more impressive than a guy with an automatic weapon who hits the same number of people by spraying lots of bullets and hoping that some of them connect. There's that weird mix of flexibility and high level of competency that only a hero should have again. And the shorter ranges mean that your hero... There's that weird mix of flexibility and high level of competency that only a hero should have that comes up again. And the shorter ranges mean that your hero has a much better chance of looking his enemy in the eye when he's involved in a duel, rather than simply kill the guy when he's so far off that you can't see him very well. It adds to the writer's options in setting the fight scene. A lot of these features can be found in another weapon that I mentioned earlier, the scythe. I mentioned the one-handed scythe, and that was once used as an alternative mainline weapon to the spear in the ancient world, but as I think we've established, a weapon that's used by the nameless foot troops is hardly heroic. But the two-handed scythe, the one we associate with the Grim Reaper, didn't see as much use in battlefields. That's not to say that they weren't used at all. War scythes have existed for a long time, but they were more likely to have the blade parallel to the pole, and the principle was similar to a halberd. But a standard scythe had its uses as well, usually for getting around an enemy's shield and formation and striking them from behind, particularly if the scythe wielder was standing behind a rank of men with their own shields. What didn't usually happen in real life was for someone to wield a scythe with the level of flair and dexterity that we see in shows like Ruby, or in anime. Interestingly enough, the Egyptians were one particular army that used war scythes in the Bronze Age, and they were the first army to popularize the one-handed scythe, the khopesh, as a mainline weapon for their armies. What's odd about this is that the Egyptian version of the Grim Reaper, the god Anubis, is sometimes portrayed wielding a khopesh. It's hard to say for sure, given that this is based on evidence left behind by a civilization over 4,000 years old, but given that the khopesh held a lot of significance in Egyptian culture, both in mythology and in the culture as a whole, it is possible that the reason why they became popular weapons for their Egyptian infantry was an imitation of Anubis, or maybe vice versa. And the fact that the khopesh walks a line between a scythe and a sword is not lost on me. There's one other weapon I wanted to take a moment to discuss, particularly because it became a significant replacement for swords in battlefields once armor became more common in Europe, particularly iron and steel armor: the hammer. Unlike the sword, hammers actually were a symbol of masculinity for a time, particularly among Norse mythology. The reason Thor wields a hammer is because it was a tool that could be used to both create and destroy, which is how these cultures often viewed masculinity. Now, depending on the size and shape, a hammer isn't necessarily the most efficient weapon for fighting an armored opponent. A mace, which is usually lighter and more aerodynamic, and can therefore be swung faster, tended to be the weapon of choice for fighting heavily armored enemies. But that would cut away at the symbolism of the hammer. People often used weapons not just because they were efficient, but because they had significant meaning. Basically, the rule of cool has been around forever, and people have been fighting with the coolest weapons they could find ever since we figured out how to tie a rock to a stick. The thing about a hammer is that it can only really be used for constructive purposes when it's intact, which is a nice comparison to masculinity. You can shave off some of the metal of a hammer, take the sides off the hammer head, almost like removing some of that masculinity, and you'd end up with a mace. Less masculine, lighter, and potentially better at the destruction side of things, but no longer capable of the creation part. Boy, I wouldn't want to make this video into a soapbox or anything. Maybe now's a good time to cut to today's featured game. I was going to make today's featured game be Blue Prince, which was fantastic, but half the streamers I follow are already playing it, which means it's already got plenty of attention. I was tempted to do the remastered Oblivion, just to go through the weapons that lined up with my points, but in addition to that not being an indie-developed game, I couldn't get to run on my computer without crashing every 5 feet. I see some things never change, eh, Bethesda? So instead, we're going to do a game called Kill the Crows. Technically, the game was first released in 2023, but to hell with it. This is my channel, I'll review what I want. Kill the Crows is a point-and-click gunslinger game in which you kill a bunch of bandits. They don't look anything like crows. Maybe it's their gang name? Not a whole lot is explained, and I don't think this game is going for much in the way of a story or a narrative. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is meant to be a game where you simply blow off steam. Which is fine, but I found it underwhelmingly boring. Not to say that the combat wasn't difficult. The game is hard enough to be a challenge, but that didn't change the fact that I wasn't engaged with it. This is the problem with reviewing games. Sometimes you find that one game that you don't like for reasons that might just be a matter of taste, and it's hard to say if the game is actually bad or if it's just not for you. So if you're the kind of person who enjoys games like this, Kill the Crows might be worth a try. Alright, that's all I have for today. Thank you all, and goodbye.